the story begins with a scene where the world was being overrun by monsters. It was the day the gate to another world opened, unleashing thousands of monstrous creatures. This day marked the moment when the world fell. Amid the countless humans helplessly succumbing to the onslaught, only a small fraction awakened supernatural abilities. These individuals, known as the saviors of humanity, were commonly referred to as players. Among them was a player who began as an F rank but would later become known as the Great Steel Emperor, Lee Hyunwook. He was revered as the last savior of humanity, a title that would come to define him in the memories of those who heard this tale. However, at that moment, Lee was jolted back to reality, reminding himself that his life was a mess and in complete ruins. At the time, he was diligently performing his routine drills alongside other awakened players. The commander of their squad was barking orders, urging them to execute their drills with precision and to avoid slacking off. All humans who had awakened their abilities were conscripted into the anti-monster troops. These individuals, known as players, were tasked with using their newfound skills to serve their country and protect humanity. Lee Hyunwook, while still in an awkward position during his morning practice, found himself questioning why he was in such circumstances if he was destined to become the last savior of humanity. Later, the players remained at the AMT shooting range, their training continuing in the same tense atmosphere. The commander, addressing the group, expressed his disbelief that the strongest humans on Earth had somehow managed to lose track of 9 cartridges. While the commander was speaking, Lee discreetly retrieved a bullet from his pocket using his magic abilities. In a swift and almost imperceptible motion, he directed the bullet toward his mouth and swallowed it. The moment he consumed the bullet, a system notification appeared, informing him that the weight of the metal currently available for manipulation was now 300 grams. Lee listened as the commander berated the players, declaring that they had all lost their minds. Hearing this, Lee silently questioned how anyone could remain in the right state of mind, especially when this was his second time serving in the army. He vividly remembered what the future held. In the end, humanity would face complete annihilation, but it would not be at the hands of the monsters. Instead, it would be the players who brought about the destruction of humanity. As memories of the past flooded his mind, Lee recalled lying on the ground, bruised and battered, teetering on the edge of death. In that moment of despair, a mysterious man appeared before him. The last hero of humanity, the Great Steel Emperor, F-rank Lee Hyunwook, was on the brink of death, powerless to change the course of the current catastrophe. In that dire moment, Lee confessed to the mysterious man that he had never imagined the world would meet its end not because of the monsters but due to the actions of the players themselves. The mysterious man, upon hearing those words, raised his voice, refuting Lee's claim. He declared that Lee was mistaken and revealed that he and his comrades were divine beings who had come to deliver judgment upon humanity. Lee, irritated by the man's words, retorted that neither he nor his comrades were divine beings, they were villains, plain and simple. He declared that if he had only known how to grow stronger a year or even a day earlier, he would have easily killed the man and his comrades without hesitation. The man, hearing Lee's defiance, merely smiled and asked if Lee was frustrated by the situation he found himself in. With a tone of condescension, the man told Lee not to despair, claiming that even if Lee had learned earlier, someone as weak and useless as an F-rank would have died regardless. At that moment, a giant humanoid figure wielding an enormous weapon appeared, its presence casting an ominous shadow. The man turned to Lee, stating that the death awaiting him was the most fitting for someone like him, an F-rank. The towering figure swung its massive weapon with terrifying force, delivering a devastating blow to Lee's head and ending his life instantly. As Lee reflected on the events, he acknowledged that this was how he had died in his previous life. Yet there was one thing he had never anticipated, the chance to regress, as though he were a character in a web novel. Back in the present, the system announced Lee's progress and congratulated him for realizing how to grow stronger. It further informed him that 10 minutes remained until metal absorption would conclude, with the weight of metal available for manipulation currently standing at 300 grams. As Lee processed the system's message, the commander shouted at the group, declaring that he would fix their rotten minds. He instructed the players that when he said 1, they were to respond with soldier, and when he said to, they were to respond with mindset. Without hesitation, the commander began chanting, and the players echoed his commands in unison. Lee, meanwhile, felt a flicker of irritation. Despite his return to the past, his skills had been reset to their starting point, a frustrating setback. However, he resolved to move forward, vowing to reclaim his former abilities and grow even stronger than before. Yet, a nagging thought lingered in his mind. He could not understand why his regression had brought him back to this particular time, forcing him to endure his days in the army once again. As time passed, the day's training eventually came to an end. The players gathered in another location, where the corporal addressed them. He informed the players of Platoon 3, Squad 2, that they were to enter the building. As he continued giving instructions, some of the players who were still waiting began chatting among themselves. One of them mentioned that he had heard the menu for the day would include sausage stir-fry with chicken stew. The news sparked excitement among the group, lifting their spirits. Lee, however, remained disheartened. His regression to the time when he was still undergoing military training weighed heavily on him. He had never imagined he would find himself back in this place, reliving these moments. The corporal, whose name was Oh Sang-guk, eventually called out to the standby squad, which included Lee. He informed them that they needed to complete a task before they could go and eat. Frustrated, Lee pointed out that they had just finished a full day of training. The corporal, hearing Lee's complaint, merely smiled and dismissed it. With a tone of indifference, he replied that he had no knowledge of the standby squad training all day, effectively ignoring Lee's protest. Upon hearing Oh Sang-guk's words, Lee suddenly recalled the past and recognized the man standing before him. It was none other than the infamous army nuisance, Oh Sang-guk, a figure Lee remembered vividly as the embodiment of arrogance and spite. As Lee's memories resurfaced, Oh Sang-guk spoke to him in a condescending tone, addressing him as a loser. He asked if Lee was implying that Oh Sang-guk's squad should be the ones doing the work in Lee's place. With a sneer, Oh Sang-guk added that Lee and his squad, being mere F-ranks who couldn't even level up, had no choice but to take on extra work to compensate for their inadequacies. With an irritating expression, he remarked that this was precisely why Lee was there. Lee recalled how, in the past, he had resigned himself to the belief that he would never surpass the limitations of being an F-rank, viewing himself as a failure. Now, the bitterness of those memories resurfaced. Oh Sang-guk pressed his finger against Lee's forehead and demanded to know if Lee and his squad would take responsibility if something urgent occurred while Oh Sang-guk and his squad were burdened with work. He then warned Lee not to expect any special treatment, even if Lee himself was a corporal. As Oh Sang-guk continued to berate him, Lee's frustration boiled over, and he glared at Oh Sang-guk with a burning intensity. Noticing the look, Oh Sang-guk paused and asked why Lee was staring at him that way, his voice dripping with disdain. Oh Sang-guk demanded to know if Lee wanted to die, his tone menacing as he activated his powers. In that moment, he challenged Lee directly, asking if he wanted to go head-to-head with him. Sang-guk reminded Lee that he was a D rank, clearly asserting his superiority. However, just as Sang-guk was about to make his move, Lee's expression suddenly shifted into a bright, disarming smile. Lee calmly told Sang-guk that he would take on the task assigned to them but suggested that Sang-guk allow them to eat before starting the job. Sang-guk paused, momentarily taken aback by the unexpected change in Lee's demeanor. Lee seized the moment, gesturing subtly to the others around them. He pointed out that Sang-guk's behavior might come across as abusive to onlookers. Lee added that he was concerned such behavior could lead to strange rumors about Sang-guk, tarnishing the reputation of someone who was supposed to be a respectable figure in the future. With a sharp, menacing smile, Lee concluded by telling Sang-guk that he had the potential to achieve great things someday. However, for that to happen, Sang-guk needed to conduct himself in a more appropriate manner. Oh Sang-guk, hearing Lee's response, reluctantly agreed, though inwardly he was unsettled. This was not how he had expected the situation to unfold. Lee then spoke up again, assuring Sang-guk that since it was his order, Lee and his squad would eat quickly and finish the assigned task just as fast. Sang-guk, unsure how to proceed, awkwardly cleared his throat and complimented Lee, telling him he was doing a good job. Turning to the others standing nearby and watching the exchange, Sang-uk barked at them to stop gawking and go eat. Lee, meanwhile, addressed one of his squad members, Park Junwo, and told him to take the rest of the squad to eat, explaining that he himself didn't feel like eating. Park Junwo nodded and complied, leading the group away. As Sang-uk watched them leave, he found himself deep in thought. Something about Lee felt different, as if he wasn't the same person he used to be. The shift in Lee's demeanor left Sang-uk unsettled and unsure of what had just transpired. Moments later, Lee reached a secluded corner, exhaled deeply, and silently congratulated himself for handling the situation well. He thought to himself that dealing with Sang-uk was trivial compared to the looming shadow of Gordon Precy, the man responsible for his death in his first life. The memory of Gordon's countless atrocities resurfaced, filling Lee with frustration and anger. He cursed Gordon bitterly, vowing that things would be different this time. Lee thought to himself that if he continued to cause trouble while stationed there, he would only prolong his stay and risk losing his chance to catch up to Gordon. Resolving to avoid unnecessary conflicts, he decided to keep a low profile for as long as he remained in the military. As he mulled over his plans, the system suddenly appeared before him, informing him that he could now manipulate 1 gram more of steel. It further notified him that the metal absorption process was complete and that the total weight of metal available for manipulation was now 309 grams. Seeing the notification, Lee shifted his focus, determined not to dwell on other distractions. Holding a handful of spoons in his grasp, he reminded himself that under no circumstances could he let anyone discover that he could level up. Back at the cafeteria, soldiers began murmuring among themselves, puzzled about the sudden disappearance of all the spoons. One of the players, noticing the odd situation, called out to Park Junmo, a private, and informed him that there seemed to be a problem. Every spoon in the cafeteria had mysteriously vanished. Meanwhile, outside the cafeteria, Lee stood in a quiet corner, discreetly ingesting the spoons he had taken. He knew that every bit of metal he consumed brought him one step closer to regaining his strength and preparing for the challenges ahead. As Lee continued, the system popped up again, notifying him that metal absorption was about to begin. It informed him that there were 13 minutes remaining until the process was complete, and the weight of the metal currently available for manipulation was 309 grams, with an expected absorption of 1.25 grams. Lee took out his knife and began to assess his options. He thought to himself that his M7 bayonet weighed 140 grams. If he wanted to increase its impact by adding more weight, he would only be able to control a small fraction of it. He also noted that cartridges weighed only 1 gram, while spoons weighed 1.25 grams. At this rate, it would take far too long to regain the strength he had lost before his death. Lee found himself in a dilemma, unsure of how to proceed. Gazing at a monument in the distance, Lee reflected on whether this was the only option left for him to increase his power and level up. He decided that, if it was indeed his only solution, he had 3 days to prepare. With a serious expression, Lee resolved that he would have to face and defeat a boss mob while still at level 1. He knew it would be a difficult challenge, but it was the only path forward if he wanted to regain his strength quickly. As Lee spoke those words, he activated his powers to sheath his knife without physically touching it. A menacing smile crept across his face as he told himself that he would show those who doubted him what it truly meant to be an expert player. 3 days later, at the 3rd Brigade, 1st Battalion Station Namsan, 5th Post, Lee Hyunwook and Park Junmo were stationed as guards during the night shift. As they stood watch, Park Junmo glanced at Lee and spoke up, noting that Lee seemed to have changed recently. Lee, upon hearing this, asked Park if he felt uncomfortable with the change in his behavior. Park, startled by the question, quickly panicked and reassured Lee that he didn't mean anything negative. At that moment, the system appeared before Lee, informing him that he could now manipulate 6 grams more. It also announced that the metal absorption process was complete, and the total weight of metal available for manipulation had increased to 1,359 grams. Park, realizing he had caused some confusion, clarified his earlier comment, telling Lee that what he had meant to say was that Lee had changed for the better. As Park spoke, Lee suddenly turned towards him, catching Park off guard. Surprised by the sudden movement, Park listened as Lee asked if he trusted him. Park, still a bit startled, responded that he did indeed trust Lee. Hearing this, Lee smiled to himself, knowing that the time had come to carry out his plan. Moments later, near the gate from which the monsters would emerge, Lee was engaged in battle. Using his powers, he controlled his bayonet with precision, directing it without needing to physically hold it. He launched the weapon towards the monsters, dealing damage and annihilating them one by one. While fighting, Lee couldn't help but smile menacingly. He thought to himself that he never expected to be so happy to face the monsters again. He had waited 3 long days for this moment. After dealing significant damage to one of the monsters, Lee noticed it was still standing, though badly injured. As he observed it, he thought to himself that he had never failed an ambush before. This, however, was proof that he was still at level 1, and despite his new powers, he was still very weak. While using his bayonet, Lee thought to himself that this was his second chance at life, and he didn't like repeating the same tasks. As the monsters charged toward him, he warned them that if they dropped anything unworthy, they would truly be dead to him. Without hesitation, Lee slashed the head off one of the monsters charging at him, killing it instantly. The remaining monsters, seeing the deadly effectiveness of Lee's attack, became much more cautious. Meanwhile, Lee focused on the monster drop lying on the ground after his kill. He knew the future and understood that consuming steel was key to growing stronger. With that in mind, he used his powers to lift the drop from the floor and ate it. The monster, witnessing this strange act, was confused by Lee's actions. The drop Lee consumed was known as mana steel, and as soon as he ate it, the system popped up to congratulate him for consuming mana steel, a metal from another world. It also informed Lee that there were 24 minutes remaining until metal absorption and that the weight of the metal currently available for manipulation was 1,359 grams. It added that there would be an expected increase in weight after absorption, and mana would also increase as a result. Upon hearing what the system had told him, Lee laughed menacingly as he realized that by consuming everything he came across, life's difficulties in this new reality would become far easier for him. With this newfound understanding, Lee called upon his bayonet once more, pointing it toward the monsters, and declared that the mukbang was about to begin. Before Lee could engage with the monsters, he remembered that Park had placed his trust in him. Lee readied his weapons, and just as a huge roar echoed in the distance, he swiftly silenced Park before he could speak. Lee then slowly informed Park that he could sense the movement of metal. Park, surprised by this, responded that he had assumed Lee could only sense metal that was visible to him, so he was astonished to hear that Lee could sense metal even when it was out of sight. In that moment, Lee thought to himself that what he had told Park was a lie. However, Park then suggested that Lee should report this ability, but Lee quickly dismissed the idea. He explained to Park that the branch office would never believe such a claim, especially from someone like him, an F rank who could sense an invisible and unconfirmed metal. Upon hearing that, Park asked Lee what they should do next. Lee told Park to promise him one thing: he was going to investigate what was happening, and Park should not leave his post under any circumstances. Lee also insisted that Park must not report anything to the higher-ups because Lee knew that if the military found out, they would claim all the weapons dropped by the monsters for themselves. Back in the present, Lee charged toward the monsters. As they prepared to attack him, Lee easily dodged their strikes and countered with his own, slashing at the monsters' legs to prevent them from moving freely. As Lee continued his assault, a monster, seemingly the leader of the group, watched the situation unfold from the rear. Lee, however, didn't stop. He taunted the monsters, encouraging them to keep screaming, as it would only amplify their fear. Then, he shouted at the monsters, revealing that in his previous life, he had been killed by an attack from behind. Furious, Lee warned the monsters that if any of them dared to attack him from behind again, he would devour them alive. The monsters, seeing Lee's fury, began to panic. Lee, noticing their fear, realized that he had instilled enough terror in these unintelligent creatures. He decided it was time to move on to the main course. Looking around, Lee grew frustrated as he tried to locate the boss monster with his own eyes. He wondered where the goblin shaman, the cunning leader of the monsters, was hiding. Unbeknownst to Lee, the goblin shaman was perched high in a tree, seething with rage at the situation. Its subordinates were being easily defeated by Lee, and it was desperate to regain control. Lee, in the meantime, picked up an item from the ground. He thought to himself that he was doing this deliberately, creating an opportunity for the goblin shaman to attack. He knew that the goblin shaman would not miss the chance, and when it made its move, Lee would finally be able to pinpoint its location. At that moment, the goblin shaman took the bait Lee had set and activated its spell. It smiled, thinking to itself that it had finally caught Lee off guard and would end his life. However, Lee, also smiling, knew the goblin shaman had made its move and was about to reveal itself. The goblin shaman launched its spell, and from the ground where Lee was standing, hundreds of spikes shot up. The spikes not only destroyed the area but also killed the surrounding goblins who had been nearby. Elsewhere inside the base, 2 players stationed during the night were still awake. One of them called out to the platoon leader beside him, asking if he had just heard the ground shake. The platoon leader, irritated, asked if his subordinate was scared, warning him that he would kill him if he woke him up again over something trivial. The subordinate immediately agreed, understanding the leader's anger. Back with Lee, the goblins were panicking as they saw most of their comrades killed by the spell released by the goblin shaman. However, the goblin shaman continued to smile menacingly, believing it had dealt with Lee. But just as it was celebrating its victory, a voice suddenly rang out, telling the goblin shaman that it had been found. The voice was none other than Lee's. The goblin shaman was confused. How could Lee still be alive after being hit by its powerful attack? In that moment, Lee launched his attack, sending his bayonet towards the goblin shaman. But the goblin shaman managed to dodge the attack. Lee, acting disappointed for having missed, drew a mocking laugh from the goblin shaman, who taunted Lee for the failed strike. But then, Lee shouted at the goblin shaman, calling it an idiot and revealing that he had missed on purpose. Lee's bayonet knife was then launched again toward the goblin shaman. However, just as the attack was about to strike, Lee was stunned. Not only did the goblin shaman dodge the attack again, but it also caught the bayonet knife with its bare hands. Lee, smiling, told the goblin shaman that he was speechless, impressed by its ability to catch his great sword. He added that it seemed like he had really been a failure in his past life. The goblin shaman, on the other hand, was furious, realizing it had fallen into Lee's trap. Lee then spoke up, telling the goblin shaman that for someone who had sent a whole gang of goblins after him, it had no right to complain about getting a small scratch. He shouted at the goblin shaman, telling it to come down from where it was standing because he was going to slice it and all its subordinates in one go. However, after saying that, Lee thought to himself that he had just bluffed about what he was going to do. As he looked around at the goblins surrounding him, he wondered what he should do next. With the boss now fighting him head-on, and the goblin's spirits high, the situation was much more complicated than he had anticipated. As Lee was thinking about his situation, the system suddenly popped up, warning him that he had consumed mana rapidly in a short amount of time and now had less than 40% of his mana remaining. The system cautioned Lee to be careful when using mana. Lee, seeing this, realized that there was a more pressing issue at hand, his dwindling mana. He told himself that since things had come to this point, he had no choice but to act. He then shouted at the goblin shaman, telling it that if he couldn't consume the shaman, they would both die together. He added that, even if it took time, he would eat the goblin shaman and then head to the guardhouse. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.